You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do Mini. I am your host, Abraham.
And I'm Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about all of the things that people do, and sometimes we do it in a very short format we call a mini, which we release on Mondays, Mini Mondays with our minis. Let's tell a quick story here. I'll let you take this one because this is a story you kind of know.
I'm familiar with it, yeah. So David Berkowitz killed 6 people in 8 shootings between 1976 and 1977 in New York City, claiming to have carried out his executions under the orders of, quote, Father Sam, an ancient demon who possessed his neighbor's dog. Quote, the son of Sam killer's lawyers used the now famous Twinkie defense. There's so many things to unpack in this story. Used the Twinkie defense to argue that Berkowitz's poor diet and life circumstances exacerbated his mood swings and made him more violent. This is one of the most famous cases of defense lawyers attempting to use a, quote, temporary insanity, end quote, defense. So we are all familiar with that term, temporary insanity case. We've probably seen that more than once or heard about it more than once.
Yeah. Most people will have heard of temporary insanity as a legal plea in a criminal trial, or maybe even at least as a colloquial excuse for someone's behavior. I think I could imagine someone saying, oh, I must have been temporarily insane or something like that.
Yeah.
And then voted one particular way in the 2020 election or 2016 election.
Uh-huh.
But what does this mean and how does this work? Like when someone says temporarily insane, is that a thing? Like what's going on here?
Yeah, so let's talk about the history of this a little bit. So the temporary insanity defense was first used in 1843 in England after a man named Daniel Macnaghten attempted to assassinate the British Prime Minister. That's a pretty hefty crime.
Yes, yeah. His lawyers somewhat successfully argued that his mental state was unstable and he was acquitted for this. The judge acquitted him because they said, like, yeah, he was temporarily insane. And this set a precedent that one could be considered not culpable for a particular crime if their mental state at the time of the offense, it was such that it, quoting the judge here, quote, 1, interferes with his ability to know or understand the nature or quality of his criminal behavior, and 2, to have compromised the defendant's ability to know or understand the legal or moral wrongness of his behavior, end quote. So those are sort of the precedent set by this judge by saying that this particular defendant was not culpable for this crime.
Right. So this gained further popularity in the 1800s to defend crimes of passion, such as jealous spouses. And I would imagine if we probably looked at the data from that time, I bet a lot of husbands got away with this for a lot of different reasons because men were kind of jerks back then, as opposed to now, which we're all totally great, right?
Yeah, I think this has been used somewhat nefariously at various points, and it will become obvious, if not already obvious, to many people where there can be a problem with this particular line of reasoning here.
Right.
So, as suggested above, essentially the idea of the temporary insanity plea, this continues to this day. The idea here is that the person should not be held responsible for their behavior if their mental state at the time of their crime was such that they could not meaningfully determine that their actions were wrongful. That's the gist of it. And the idea of it being temporary is that they returned to a normal sense of clarity shortly after the crime happened. So up until the crime took place, during, and then after the crime was finished, they're lucid and totally in control of their behavior. And for this brief window of time that conveniently overlaps their criminal behavior, they are unable to determine that what they're doing is wrong.
Right. With all of that being said, many oppose this way of thinking about crime. For one thing, should it be considered that stress and life circumstances can lead one to commit serious crimes? Couldn't all convicts make this same claim? And they all had stuff going on for them at the time of their crimes too. And I think that that's something that, like, it's one of those legal precedents that can quickly become a slippery slope without the right safeguards in place.
Yeah, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt did not like the idea of the insanity or temporary insanity plea, writing, quote, "I have scant sympathy with the plea of insanity advanced to save a man from the consequences of crime when, unless that crime had been committed, it would have been impossible to persuade any reasonable authority to commit him to an asylum as insane," end quote. And so he's sort of suggesting, like, if this person is otherwise fine, then we can't just say they're insane just because a crime took place.
Right. To that end, this defense is only used about 1% of the time. So in 75% of cases in which it is used, it is rejected. And I think that's important. It's rejected. It doesn't even make it into court. Essentially, they go, "I want to do this." And they go, "No, you can't do that before the trial." And only in those cases, 25%, in which the defendant has a long documented history of mental health issues, is a defense of insanity likely to be effective. But also at that point, it is not temporary. So to that end, some states do not make a distinction between the two. So instead of just doing a temporary insanity defense, they'll just do an insanity defense.
Yeah, sort of blanket insanity defense. And there are some implications with that. If someone is in fact found not guilty by reason of insanity, then there is a specific consequence, which is to mean, like, okay, you're not in control of your actions. That means you're not safe to be out and around people. So you may not necessarily be imprisoned in a prison, but you may be committed to some kind of psychiatric care facility or some other type of facility in which the person must remain constantly and under ongoing supervision and surveillance, and also do not have their freedom. So it's right. For those for whom this is not a relevant defense, they are gambling with their time and their lives. For those for whom it is a legitimate defense, then maybe that is a safer placement for them, I think, is the general hypothesis or the sort of orientation here.
Right. Absolutely. So I think that there's probably, you're probably going, well, what's why we do what we do stance on this? And I think that, we tend to have a stance on things. We tend to stand on business, as kids say these days, about the things that we like. But before we do that, ads.
Okay, so you've been waiting with bated breath to hear our thoughts on this. First, I will disappointingly orient you to the fact that we released an episode really early on in our legacy of this show that was called "The Morally Difficult Position of Psychology." Now, I would recommend going that direction for a much deeper discussion on what we're about to say here. But suffice it to say that the point we are making in that episode, and that's relevant for advancing this discussion, is that understanding everything everyone does all of the time is a product of our learning history up to that point and our biological circumstances. That's the reason. That's the why we do what we do. That's the actual reason, and all of those. And we can get into those specific nuanced discussions, but I could have released one minute episode where I said why we do what we do because of our learning history up to this point and our biological circumstances. That's the reason. That's why.
Right.
But it's fun to unpack, in what those specific circumstances and learning history might be. And so that's why we just keep talking. And, because apparently I like hearing my voice.
I like hearing your voice too, Abraham.
Oh, thanks.
That makes two of us. Now, the thing is that there are people who legitimately do not understand that things they do are illegal or harmful to others when they have a severe cognitive impairment or brain damage. So as somebody who works with folks that are involved in the legal system or forensically involved, this is something that I see often. And I've spent some years working with folks to get them to understand the nature of their crime before they ever get charged. It's a complicated thing.
Yeah, exactly. It is. There are people out there for whom that is legitimately the case. Maybe for those of you, it's hard to believe, but I've observed them firsthand. They really don't understand. It would be like if you went to a country where blinking too fast was hugely taboo to the point of being very offensive, and you just didn't even know that was a thing that was very offensive to those people. Now, in that case, they could tell you and then you would know.
Right.
But I think just understanding the complete lack of awareness of a thing that's considered inappropriate is where some people are. So that's one important thing here. And the implication of insanity, again, is whether someone can be held culpable. which is to say that they're responsible for their own actions. They themselves carry that responsibility and therefore should receive some state-imposed penalty as a consequence for having committed some crime. That's the implication of the idea that insanity is a reasonable excuse for behavior to have taken place.
Right. So simply looking at it from an environmental perspective, we can always understand the circumstances that lead everyone to their paths, their choices, and their criminal behavior in times that it occurs. So if you can take some time to look at that environmental perspective, you at least get some reasoning on how somebody ended up in the space that they are committing a crime.
And that means that the people with a history of criminal behavior and violence are likely to continue using that approach of criminal activity and violence to solve their problems because it's what they know how to do. And it has worked for them long enough and often enough to be their go-to approach. That is what their learning history has taught them up to this point. So for those, it means that we assume that if they have done violence in the past and they have a history of learning that teaches that this is the way to get things done, they are then also likely to do more violence in the future.
But people who were moved to action in the height of extreme emotions in an unusual circumstance don't have the same pattern. They don't have that criminal behavior in their history. Would they continue to be dangerous? We don't really know, because I don't know about anybody who's listening, but I think it's important to remember that psychologists are not psychics and that we can't, one, read your minds, and two, we can't predict the future. We can do a pretty good job of predicting patterns of behavior given enough evidence, but we can't predict the future, especially in situations where somebody has never done it before in a specific, unique circumstance, right? And it really depends on the outcome for that person too. Did they try to hide it? Did they lie? Did they evade? Did they get away with it for a while? And if so, I would guess, or we would guess, they're more likely to offend if it's something that like benefited them in some way without any sort of like negative consequences. But if they turn themselves in immediately, confessed, or otherwise expressed anguish over the behavior, they might be less likely to reoffend.
Yes, exactly. So I think about like, what does insane mean? And like, I think that's probably beyond the scope of what we're trying to cover in a mini. But if we just go with the implication, should they be held responsible? Well, I also will say one thing really quick, which is that this is already becoming a less effective defense because we have a better diagnostic model, and like we have a psychosocial model of like understanding mental health that's better than it was back then. So diagnosable conditions do constitute an extenuating circumstance in trials of this nature. But that being said, let's just continue on with what's going on. The idea that like whether or not someone's responsible for the behavior, it kind of doesn't matter to me in my mind. What matters is this likely to happen again? And what should be the feedback that they receive that informs their future behavior, which is to say, what should be the consequence? And so in my mind, like if someone is like, for whatever reason, this thing happened, and we look at the totality of the circumstances in this crime, and we then think like this person could have easily gotten out of the situation in many other ways. This is something where they had a lot of solutions at their fingertips that they could have chosen to do otherwise. That tells me that for them, they saw this for whatever reason, whether or not it's their fault that this is what their history shaped up for them. They saw their best strategy for solving this as whatever that crime was. Okay.
Right.
And that means that for them, that's their go-to move. So I think they're more likely to reoffend. If this was a situation where it came out of like a totally unexpected random burst of circumstances that are very unlikely to coalesce again, this person maybe reasonably justified this as something like, I just didn't even know what to do. I just was scrambling for anything, you know, and we see that they express in their own emotion, their own emotional, like any kind of anguish about the fact that this took place the way that it did, then that sort of indicates, and people can act like they could totally be making this up. So I'm perfectly willing to accept that maybe we need to, you know, consider this another way. But I'm just trying to think of like, in my mind, the main point is, are they likely to do something like this again? And to try and use the evidence that's available to us to rule them in or rule them out. If they look like they are trying to already to atone for this, then that seems to me that they're doing the things that indicate they're unlikely to do it again.
Right.
If they seemed like they had other alternatives, that they have a history of doing this sort of thing, that seems to me like they're their learning history has brought them to the point where this is the solution that they understand the best, and they need to be kept distant from other people so that they don't cause further harm. Like, and in my mind, like, violence is also the demarcation line. But just to say, like, that's sort of my thought about how to talk about responsibility is mostly that it doesn't matter. It's just, is it likely to happen again? And what evidence do we have to suggest that it is or isn't?
Right. And then what we can do to prevent that from happening again. Like, I think that's the thing about that's like kind of maybe the thing that we're getting at here too, is it's not just about like, is it likely to happen again? It's also about what can we do to prevent this again? And what kind of restitution is appropriate given the crime that was committed, right? Like,
right. Yeah, that is an important piece.
I think that's an important piece, like, because, if somebody is temporarily insane because of a medical condition or something like that, which I've seen cases of that too, where, okay, so they are still responsible for what happened, but to what degree and for how long are they essentially, quote unquote, in timeout, right? Like,
exactly.
When do they get time in again? And what does that look like? And I think that's the thing that we have to consider is, I think if you consider a temporary insanity plea or like, not guilty by insanity or whatever language you want to use, I think if you consider that as a compassionate look at the circumstances in which the person has engaged in this behavior and a more thorough way, instead of just looking at the crime itself and the topography of the crime, I think that we are in a better place to address the circumstances in a more meaningful and individualized way too.
Yeah, completely agree. I love that point, that let's say that it did happen, this horrible thing happened, whatever it was, whether or not, I suggested that whether or not they're insane doesn't really matter, or whether or not they're responsible, it doesn't matter. Let's just say that it was like they're unlikely to reoffend again, but there is still that piece of, okay, but someone else was still harmed in this. So we do need to have some kind of consequence that's like, these things can't happen. And so, like, having some kind of punishment does make sense. Like, it could, some kind of penalty, whatever it might be. Like, you do still have to lose your freedom for a certain amount of time by being imprisoned. You do still have to pay a fine. You maybe do have to do community service. Whatever there is, there might be, like, the restitution will depend on the scope and the magnitude of the crime itself, I think. And also, I think acknowledging sometimes accidents happen, sometimes that the people totally were not in control of the situation. They just happened to be there and on the sort of causal end of things, and that those things just took place, and that people also get away with having committed serious crimes. So this is not an easy one size fits all type of solution.
Right.
But we've already gone long for a second time in a row on a mini. So I think we should wrap it up there. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything that we need to say before we let everyone go?
I got nothing on my end.
Perfect. If you'd like to support the show, go over to our Patreon page where you can get bonus content, ad-free episodes, and that sort of thing. Otherwise, you can leave us a rating and review, like and subscribe, tell a friend. So this is our mini. It comes out on Mondays. We release regular full-length episodes on Wednesdays. Join us there. But I think that's all I have. So this is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.